Ukraine has repeatedly called for a NATO no-fly zone. However, numerous NATO countries have rejected the idea. And joining me now to discuss whether or not a no-fly zone is a good idea, as well as some of the other efforts that Canada can make to help Ukraine, is Kerry Buck, who is the former Canadian ambassador to NATO. Thank you so much for making the time. Perhaps I'll start out with that no-fly zone piece. Obviously, the concern with that is it could lead to further escalation of the conflict with other countries having to get involved. But I'm just wondering perhaps whether or not you see more positives or negatives to doing a no-fly zone.
Well, thanks very much for the question, and thanks for inviting me to talk to you today. I appreciate that. So the problem with the no-fly zone is that it's not actually a simple thing to achieve unless Russia were to agree. And if Russia were to agree, it would be a very good thing, because the humanitarian disaster in Ukraine right now is getting worse, particularly in some areas like Mariupol. But basically, there's been a lot of targeting of civilians, right? So the humanitarian situation is really dire. There are people starving. There are people who don't have food, they don't have water. So something to allow humanitarian access in and to let people out would be really important. And if Russia were to agree to it, and I know that's part of the talks, that would be a really great outcome. But if Russia weren't to agree, then NATO would have to be in the position of imposing a no-fly zone. And imposing a no-fly zone requires a couple of things. It requires the capacity and the political willingness to shoot down any planes that are going to violate the no-fly zone. Well, those would be Russian planes. So a political willingness to shoot down Russian pilots. And not only that, to determine if you really want to close the skies, create a no-fly zone, you also have to make sure that the enemy, in this case Russia, can't launch missiles from their own territory that would hit the skies, that would hit the people inside Ukraine. So it could require NATO being ready to go in and take out some of those ground missile capabilities inside Russia. So imposing a no-fly zone is exactly the same as declaring war on Russia. And declaring war on Russia, there are a few huge risks there, right? First, Russia's a nuclear power, and Vladimir Putin has been saber rattling, is what, it's a term of art we've used for nuclear saber rattling. He's been threatening the use of nuclear weapons, and he's put his own weapons on higher readiness. But even if it stays in the zone of conventional weapons, there's a couple of other risks. Imagine the impact on Ukraine if you have NATO and Russia fighting a full-on hot war over Ukrainian territory. I could see that turning into just scorched earth for Ukraine. But the real risk is that it turns into a European war, and NATO leaders, NATO presidents, prime ministers, have an obligation to their own people not to drag their own people into a Europe-wide war. So for all those reasons, a no-fly zone or even an imposed humanitarian corridor, unless Russia agrees to it, it risks so much. And then, we've learned from the past that when you put in place even a limited humanitarian corridor, unless Russia agrees not to shoot, it can turn into a target for those humanitarian goods coming in and the people trying to get out. So all in all, a pretty dangerous idea, unless they can negotiate something. And talks are supposed to start again tomorrow.
And obviously, Ukraine isn't a member of really any alliance as it relates to NATO or even the EU, for example.
Yeah.
Do you think this would have changed anything as it relates to potentially forming a no-fly zone had Ukraine been a part of NATO?
Well, if Ukraine had been a part of NATO, NATO's the obligation or the pact that is part of the alliance, I call it the Three Musketeers Pact, all for one and one for all. And if an inch of NATO territory is breached, NATO allied territory is breached, NATO will respond with force. And that's been the message from NATO leaders from the beginning of this invasion. That being said, NATO leaders did a lot to try and deter Vladimir Putin from further invading Ukraine, because, I mean, he invaded Ukraine in 2014, right, in Crimea, and he's been waging a hot war in the eastern part of Ukraine. But there was a lot of effort put into trying to deter Vladimir Putin from doing what he did 4 weeks ago, and none of that worked. A lot of off-ramps were offered to him, and he drove right by them and went ahead with his full-scale invasion anyway. So, deterring him, I don't know if that was possible. I think we all made a mistake. Well, you had to try, right? But I think the international community underestimated his intentions and his ambition in relation to Ukraine. And that's horrifying. It's the worst security situation in Europe, I think, in more than a generation, since the Second World War.
And obviously, there's lots of other democracies within Europe. I mean, how can we ensure that these other democracies can maintain their independence and maintain their democracies from having a similar thing happen as to what's going on in Ukraine right now?
Yeah, and that is a great question. So NATO heads of state met last Thursday, I think it was. So that's 3-4 days ago. One of the things they decided was they would give more help to Ukraine, but that they would also give help to some of those countries in Europe that aren't allies, that aren't parts of NATO, but that would be more susceptible to Russian pressure. So countries like Bosnia-Herzegovina or Georgia. So NATO's pledged to do their best to help bolster those states to ensure that Russia doesn't increase its pressure on them. But the other area that all of us have to worry about, all allies and other democracies in Europe, is doing things that are outside of defense to help give ourselves more democratic resilience. So we need to think through things like cyber resilience. Russia they attacked Estonia in 2007 and tried to wipe out their whole banking system and their governance system. And Estonia is one of the most wired countries in the world, but they got through that. So all of us need to think really hard about cyber resilience. We also have to think really hard about the resilience of our democracies. So do we know how to counter disinformation? Do Canadian citizens even know how to recognize disinformation? What happens in social media when disinformation creates, widens the rifts and increases polarization inside democracies? There's a lot of work that we need to do that's in both the defense domain and civilian security domain and just the civil domain, democracy, to make sure that we're a little more resilient to these kinds of attacks that aren't necessarily going to be military attacks, but are attacks that can be really damaging.
And then as one final question, as the final conclusion, I guess, that I've taken out of our conversation today and listening to other people speak, as well as that a NATO no-fly zone has a lot of risks attached to it. So is there anything right now, even if it's just on a temporary basis until maybe a NATO no-fly zone is thought of a little bit more, is there any measures that maybe could, I guess, punish Russia to the same level as a no-fly zone that wouldn't allow such escalation from other countries?
Well, that's another great question. I wish there was an easy answer, but the sanctions that the international community put in place, and those go well beyond NATO, right? They go well beyond the West. Those have been pretty punishing, but those won't really be felt soon enough to stop Vladimir Putin right now. There's still room for sanctions, and it'll be very interesting to see how far Europe is prepared to go to wean itself off of European oil and gas, because that is the majority of the Russian government budget. And without that income, they really would be forced to their knees, because something has to be done to drive Vladimir Putin to a place where he understands that the costs of continuing this war outweigh the benefits. I don't think he's there yet. So more sanctions, more arms to help Ukraine fight their own fight, more anti-tank, more anti-air, a lot of humanitarian assistance. And we also have to start thinking about reconstruction for the after phase, but that's a different question than the one you asked. So yes, there's more that can be done, especially on the weapons. I think the window is pretty narrow, so the international community needs to step up even more. But that's what the leaders said they'd do last Thursday, and so we'll see how things unfold. But it's tragic, honestly.
Okay, that is the former Canadian ambassador to NATO, Kerry Buck. Good of you to make the time, and thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate that.